In this video, you're going to learn a bit more about the different ways you can select elements from your document. So currently, we haven't had much trouble selecting the elements we're interested in working with. We selected elements to remove them, read their values, or in this case, we selected an element to add a click listener. But as we add more elements to the page, we're going to run into issues where selecting by tag isn't going to work very well. Let's go ahead and explore a quick example by adding a second button into the Notes application. Right below the Create Note button, I'm going to add a new one, a new button with some text, and I'll set the text value to something like Remove All Notes. And the Remove All Notes button is going to be responsible for removing all of the notes currently stored wherever we're storing them. But for now, the goal is to just attach a unique event listener. So how would we get that done using what we already know? Well, we know that we can't use Query Selector for the second button because the only way we know how to grab the button is by passing in the tag name to Query Selector, and this is always going to return the first item. We're going to want to use Query Selector All, which gives us an array of all of the things that match that tag name, and then we'll pull out the second one in the array. So that would be something like document dot query selector all. We're going to query for everything in the DOM that has a tag of button. And what are we going to do? We're going to take that list back and we're going to use bracket notation to get an item. Not the first item with an index of 0, but the second item with an index of 1. Then we can go ahead and toss on add event listener, and we could add on our listener for a click, for example, and we could set up our function. For the moment, let's just set up a simple function that prints a message, console.log delete all notes. Is this code going to work? The answer is absolutely. This code is perfectly valid. We grab all of the buttons, we get the second one, and we add our event listener. If I go over to the browser and I click the first one, the first event listener fires. If I click the second one, we get our little message. Everything is working really well. The problem is that we have a very close coupling between the structure of our HTML file and these selectors over here. So imagine that I am a UI designer and I come in here and I say, ooh, these buttons are in the wrong order. I'm going to switch them real quick for my team. So I take the button and I move it into the first position, which is the correct order. I think all is well, and I move on with my job. The problem here is that the order is so important, we've now reversed the roles. Now we have a Create Note button that's printing delete all notes, and we have a Remove All Notes button that's performing the action of the other button, and this is a problem. So what we're going to explore is a more specific way we can target various elements on our page as opposed to just targeting them by their tag name and then getting a big old list. That works, for example, where you have one button, but as you add multiple buttons, forms, inputs, and other fields, this is no longer going to be a valid solution. So what we're going to use instead are IDs and classes. Let's first talk about the ID. An ID is a way to give a unique identifier to each element on your page. It allows us to, for example, give a unique identifier to this button and then target it by its unique ID. So regardless of where it goes on the page, we're targeting it more accurately. The whole point of an ID is that it's unique. So you don't have to have an ID for your elements, as we've already seen, but you also don't want to have two elements like two buttons or a paragraph and a button with the same ID. So let's figure out how to set up an ID. To set up an ID, we're going to set up another attribute, much like we did for source on the script tag, although we're going to do it for some of our other things, like a button, for example. We can set up an ID on this button by hitting a space, setting up ID, setting it equal to, inside of quotes, some value. Now, the value in here can't contain a space, so I could use an ID like remove. If I wanted to get more specific, I could say remove all button or just remove all. Now here I'm using camel casing. While that's common for JavaScript variables, it's not common for ID and class names. What we're typically going to see are words separated by hyphens. So that would be remove hyphen all. This is just a convention, meaning that either way works. It's best to pick one and stick with it than switch between the two. I'm going to be sticking with words separated by hyphens for my ID and class names. So now we have a unique identifier that uniquely identifies this button. Let's go ahead and set up another one for the other button right here. ID equals, setting it equal to. A good name for this one would be create note, for example. And now that we have our two IDs set up, we want to go ahead and target these buttons not by their tag name like we're currently doing, but by the IDs that we just created. Let's go ahead and kick things off by removing the current value inside of quotes. We're still going to end up passing a string to query selector. It's just going to be a string following a different syntax. When we want to target by ID, we start our selector off with a hash. So right here, shift 3. And then afterwards, we provide the ID we're looking for. So in this case, I can target one of the two IDs I just set up, either remove all or create note. In this case, this is for the create note button. So right after the hash, create -note, exactly as it appears in the ID attribute in our HTML. Now we're going to be successfully targeting that button, targeting it by its ID, not by the fact that it's the first thing with a button tag in our document. Way more specific, way less likely to cause errors down the line. Now we're going to do the same thing with our second selector down below. This selector is all sorts of messy. We are using query selector all. We're not even going to use that anymore. We're going to switch it for query selector. Let's remove everything from document up until the closing square brace. And right here, we're going to use document.query selector, not query selector all. I'm going to call it. I'm going to pass to it a string just like we do above. And I'm going to start it off with the hash to target by ID. Then I provide that ID, which is remove -all. Now, if we are to save the file, we're going to see that our buttons work as expected again. The remove all notes button gets clicked. We see delete all notes. The create note button gets clicked. Its text value successfully gets switched. So by setting up those IDs over here, we're able to better target our stuff over here. Now, if we were to switch the order again, something that previously broke our event handlers, we're going to see that they no longer break. I'll switch the order, save the file. Over in the browser, the order does not come into play because the buttons still have the correct IDs. So we still get our remove notes button for this. We still get our text switched for the first one. Now that we have this in place, I want to talk about the other thing we can use to better target inside of our markup, and this is the class. So we have IDs, we have classes. IDs are unique to at most one element on your page. Classes can be held by multiple elements. So for example, if I have a list of notes, I might give each note a class of note so I can target it easily from the JavaScript. So let's go ahead and do just that. I'm going to give both of these paragraphs the same class. To create a class, just like an ID, we type a space, we set up the attribute, we set it equal to, and we pick a value for the class. I'm going to use the value of note. The difference between IDs and classes is not only can multiple elements have the same class, each element can have as many classes as you need. If you need a second one, you just type a space and you give it a second class name, like some other class. For now though, there is going to be no need to have multiple classes, so we can just stick with a single class like this. Now let's do the exact same thing for the second paragraph down below. Setting up class, setting it equal to, inside of quotes the same thing, note. Now we're going to have a really easy way to target everything that has a class of note from our JavaScript. Why might we want to do that? Well, for the remove all button, we might want to remove all of those elements. So down below, we could do just that. Right here, what I'm going to use is document.query selector. Now, query selector is typically used with IDs because there's just one. Query selector all is typically used with classes because we're trying to get everything that has that class. In here, we provide our quote, and then inside of quotes, what do? Well, we start off with hashes for IDs, and we start off with dots for classes. So in this case, it would be dot note. Now we're going to have a list of all of the things that have a note class, and we could do something with them, like use for each to iterate over them. I'll call the individual thing a note, and then we'll use note.remove to remove them all. So this is going to have the effect of removing all of the things with the note class. I'll save the file. I'll click the Remove All Notes button, and that is exactly what happens. We were successfully able to target everything with that note class, and we were able to wipe them all by using for each and the remove method. Now, if you've worked with CSS before, you should be familiar with this syntax. This is how we target stuff in CSS too, to apply styles to it. We use the exact same patterns in Query Selector and Query Selector All. So real quick, I'm going to paste a few examples down below of other ways we could get this done. So here we target everything that has a p tag. Here we target elements that have an ID of replace. Here we target all of the elements that have a class of item, but we can actually chain multiple things together. For example, I could target a paragraph tag if it has the ID of order. So if I had the ID of order on some other element like a button, this wouldn't match that. I could also target all buttons with a class name of inventory. I could target an H1 that has both an ID of title and a class of application, and I could target an H1 that has a class of application and an ID of title. So the order the two come in don't matter. The only important thing is that your tag comes first when we're setting up multiple different things in our selector. Otherwise, it would look pretty weird. What if I wanted to select buttons with the ID of remove all, for example? If I put it up front, we can easily parse this. We start off with the tag name. After the hashtag, we have remove all. But what if I tried to put button at the end? It doesn't really make much sense. Is button a tag name, or is that part of the ID? So if you do want to set up more complex selectors, this is the way to get that done, something we'll be exploring throughout the course. For the most part though, we're going to be selecting by just a single class or a single ID. These are useful, but they don't come up too often in our JavaScript. All right, that's where we're going to stop for the moment, and I will leave notes about these in the PDF guide for the course, so there's no need to write those out. Let's go ahead and wrap this video up with a quick challenge requiring you to use what you've learned here. This is going to be a really easy one. All I want you to do is add an ID onto our add to do button and then target it by its ID in our JavaScript as opposed to targeting it by its tag name, which is what we're currently doing. So take a few seconds to knock that out, come back and click play. All right, nothing too crazy there. Right here on this button, we're going to set up an ID. So space, our attribute ID equals something. We can call this one something like add-to-do, for example. Just as a note, if I wanted to add another attribute right after that quote, I would just add another space and add something like class. So here I could add the class of test onto the button as well. But in this case, we just needed an ID, a better way to target the button. Now that we have the class set up, let's go ahead and actually use it. Excuse me, we have an ID set up, add to do. Over here, we're going to swap out our selector. We're no longer going to select it by its tag name, but by its ID. So hash to select by ID, then the name, add-to-do. Now that we have this in place, the last thing to do is to test it. I'm going to switch over to the to-do application, click that button, and I do still get my message, which is awesome. Everything is still working, even though we've switched how we're targeting the button. Now that we know the basics of more advanced queries, we're going to be able to continue on and learn about more form fields and all sorts of interesting user interaction. I'm excited to continue on with this section, so let's go ahead and jump right in to the next one.